Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the lecture on IFRS 12 presented by the CA Academy. And this lecture, of course, deals with the disclosure requirements when you have an investment in a subsidiary, an associate, a joint venture, or an unconsolidated structured entity. And remember that a structured entity is now the new term for what we previously called a special purpose vehicle or an SPV. All right, so if we move on to chapter number 1, and I'd like to just go through a quick introduction to IFRS 12. You can once again see that this has been an ongoing project since 2010, and then on 12 May 2011, IFRS 12 was published with an effective date of 1 January 2013. So once again, yet another examinable pronouncement for your CTA, possibly undergraduate, but definitely also for your QE Part 1. Very important that you know this disclosure. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a very theoretical topic. It's unfortunately something that you're going to have to sit down and study. So it's very important that you take these slides and that you actually use them as a checklist, that you tick off what you know and that you go through all of those things and make sure that you know what to disclose. All right, so this is very theoretical. There's not a lot that's conceptual about it. So I just want to give you a basic exposure of what these areas are that should be separately disclosed. Now, what's important that you remember, if you've looked at the exam technique lecture on the website or on your DVD set, you'll remember that disclosure is in the notes to the financial statements, where presentation is on the face to the financial or of the financial statements. So in this case, you can see the topic that we're doing here is disclosure requirements. So it is very important that you remember that these are all the disclosure requirements in the notes to the financial statements. If we move on to slide number 6, you can see there IFRS 12 requires disclosure of information that enables the users of the financial statements to evaluate two main areas. The first one, the nature of and risks associated with interests of the reporting entity in other entities. So this basically gives the user an understanding. What you want to explain here is what is the investments that you hold, what is the kind of relationship that you have, being control, significant influence, joint control, all of those things, and just to give your user a better understanding of all the investments that this company has made. And then secondly, the effects of those interests on the financial position, financial performance, and cash flows of the reporting entity. So the fact that we've invested in this, the fact that we've consolidated our subsidiaries, the fact that we have proportionately, not proportionately, but equity accounted our joint ventures, equity accounted our investments in associates, the reasons that our unconsolidated structured entities have remained unconsolidated. All right, all of those things will give the user a better understanding. So this information is really supplementary. It is to improve transparency, to increase the usefulness of the financial statements, but really very theoretical to study. And that's why I think these slides will go far in just getting you, to the basic understanding of what it is that should be disclosed. IFRS 12 must be applied by an entity that has an interest in any of the following: subsidiaries, joint arrangements, whether it's joint operations or joint ventures. So it's very important, any IFRS 11 investment, do you agree, where there's joint control. All right, so there's a joint arrangement where joint control has been established by means of a contractual arrangement, then this disclosure will apply to that investment as well. Then associates, investments in associates where you exercise significant influence, and then unconsolidated structured entities that we previously called special purpose entities, special purpose vehicles, and that was previously dealt with under SIC 12. Do you agree? And that has now been replaced by IFRS 10 and the new definition of control that is all-encompassing, including that of SPEs. In Chapter 2, I would like us to have a look at the key definitions in IFRS 12 so that we know when the standard talks about an interest in another entity that you actually know exactly what it is that they're looking for. On to slide number 8, an interest in another entity. What do they explain that to be? Because the moment you identify that you have an interest in another entity, then that would be the definition being satisfied, and of course the disclosure requirements becoming applicable to that entity. This refers to contractual and non-contractual involvement that exposes an entity to variability of returns from the performance of the other entity. All right? An interest in another entity can be evidenced by, but is not limited to, the holding of equity or debt instruments, as well as other forms of involvement such as the provision of funding, liquidity support, credit enhancement, and guarantees. It includes the means by which an entity has control or joint control or significant influence over another entity, and an entity does not necessarily have an interest in another entity solely because of a typical customer-supplier relationship. All right, so if we look at those components of the definition, you can see that an interest in another entity extends further than just an interest in the equity of that company, holding shares in that company, but especially if you look at the second bullet point, things like holding equity instruments, those would be shares, debt instruments in that company. You're talking about debentures, redeemable preference shares, bonds, all of those things relating to that. That's also an interest in another entity, as well as other forms of involvement such as, look at that, the provision of funding, liquidity support, credit enhancement, guarantees that we provided, and then all of those similar or like transactions. Okay, so what you need to learn from the definition is that it extends a bit further, but at least your investments in subsidiaries, associates, joint arrangements, and then your unconsolidated structured entities. All of this disclosure will definitely, as a minimum, apply to those entities, but the definition of another entity in which you hold an interest must be read very widely. Okay. You must realize that all of these disclosure requirements are very onerous, and that is why you must make sure that you actually qualify as an entity that has an interest in another entity before IFRS 12 requirements will be applicable to you. If we move on to slide number 9, what is important here, a structured entity. We need to know what a structured entity is. And I want to remind you here of the previous SIC 12, special purpose entities, SPEs, special purpose vehicles, SPVs. All of those entities are now called structured entities. The reason that you need to know what they are is because if they are not consolidated, there's specific disclosure that is required in respect of those entities. Now, what is a structured entity? An entity that has been designated so that voting or similar rights are not the dominant factor in deciding who controls the entity, such as when any voting rights relate to administrative tasks only, and the relevant activities are directed by means of contractual arrangements. Now, this is interesting because in IFRS 10, we spoke about what a structured entity is. And we said that when you look at control and all of those things that play a role, you can't just go for a power instrument that says, I've got voting rights. Because if you have the majority of the voting rights, you can possibly, if you look at this definition, only have them in respect of irrelevant activities. Okay? So, sorry. That your voting rights will normally relate to the irrelevant activities, because what you will find on average, and I'm generalizing now because every structured entity can be set up in a different way, but what is normally a characteristic of a structured entity is that the relevant activities are determined by reference to a contractual agreement, because these entities many times actually function on their own. They call it that autopilot mechanism. They are set up for a very specific purpose, and that is the purpose that must be fulfilled. And that's been agreed upon in the contract. So my advice to you is when you are trying to see who's controlling a structured entity, it's very important for you to have a look at the contractual arrangement rather than voting rights, because voting rights might relate to irrelevant activities, and your relevant activities are identified in the contract, and there it determines who has the ability, that current ability, to direct those relevant activities. All right. So that's why structured entities are important, because the moment they are left unconsolidated, i.e. you have come to the conclusion that control does not exist, all right, then you will have to provide disclosure requirements in respect of the structured entity, and that's very important. Okay, so those are the key definitions. If we move on, in Chapter 3, we're going to discuss the actual disclosures that are required when looking at IFRS 12. Ladies and gentlemen, in Chapter 3, we now look at the actual disclosures that are required by IFRS 12. And if you look at it, you can see that this information previously may not have been disclosed. It is quite onerous to find all of this information, but it's very achievable. So it's not unrealistic to provide these disclosures, and I think all of these disclosures will enhance the understanding of the user just in respect of what is the effect of the fact that there's an interest in another entity. What's the effect of that on the group as a whole? All right, on the reporting entity as such. Now, if we move on to slide number 11 and we look at the first set of disclosures that are required, you can see here this is quite a logical one, and I fully support this disclosure requirement regarding significant judgments and assumptions made or changes in those judgments and assumptions in determining the following items. Now, when we look at them, you will see that after having done the lecture on IFRS 11, IFRS 10, and even other IFRSs, but these are specifically relating to group setups where there's an interest in another entity, okay? That there was a lot of professional judgment required in respect of coming to certain conclusions. And that is what you will see here. These judgments and assumptions, you must just explain them logically so that the user of the financial statements can see why you came to certain conclusions. Firstly, judgments and assumptions relating to why it controls another entity. Ladies and gentlemen, you've now got a comprehensive definition of control. It's not so easy anymore. We don't just focus on a power instrument. We've got that ability, to affect the variable outcome of that entity, the power instrument that must be currently exercisable, that power instrument that must be substantive, all of those things. There's a lot of professional judgment required, and that's why just the basic things that have brought you to that particular definition, the power, the activities, the outcome, all of those things in the definition of control. Look at that lecture on IFRS 10 again. Those are the items that have to be disclosed just in a short format in the notes to the financial statements. Then the user has the ability to go and decide, do I agree or disagree with these assumptions? All right, and then that enhances their understanding of the financial statements. Secondly, that it has joint control of an arrangement or significant influence over another entity. Now, ladies and gentlemen, think about this, joint control. There's a definition for joint control, but that is affected by the fact that you have control ultimately or not. Those parties that are in a joint control arrangement must first determine whether they do have control. We discussed this in IFRS 10. And once you've proven that, you can then go and assess whether you have joint control in terms of an agreement or whether you have significant influence. Now, IS 28 provides a lot of guidance on what significant influence is. And I think students don't pay enough attention to that. The things like representation on the board, significant transactions between the two entities, etc. Transfer of staff and employees for, on a long-term basis so that knowledge, is transferred. All of those indicators of significant influence, you need to go and consult IS 28 to make sure that you know those indicators. But those are exactly what they say. Indicators. They are not guarantees of significant influence. So that's why professional judgment is required, and you need to provide the reasons that you think that significant influence or joint control exists in terms of this interest that you hold in another entity. So remember so far, what have we learned about another entity?